Hi, I'm Metta Spencer. Today, I think we're going to someplace in northern Spain, and then we'll talk to another friend here who's closer at home. He's in Ottawa. And I get to see him every now and then, but this new friend in Spain is going to be somebody I get acquainted with. His name is Nick Breeze, and he has written a book, which I love the title. It's called Cop Out. Is that right, Nick?
Yeah, that's right.
Isn't that a great title? At least if you know what it's about. And what he's discussing in it, I understand, is that the climate change outfit called Committee of Parties.
Conference of Parties, yeah.
Conference of Parties is what it stands for.
Mm-hmm.
That they, of course, have meetings very frequently. And, they're supposed to be telling us how to solve climate change, but there are some shortcomings there. So his book seems to have been largely about that. And I was tipped off to this excellent possibility of a conversation by my friend Paul Beckwith, who is in Ottawa, and he has his own video show. In fact, he can run circles around me. He does these shows at least once a week, and he was just saying, now I'm thinking about what I'm going to talk about tomorrow. And he does all these shows mostly by himself. I want to say hello to Nick. How are you?
Hello, Metta, thank you very much for having me. I'm very well, thank you. And you're right, I am in northern Spain, in Galicia, just by the coast.
You doing research there?
Well, I've been working on two projects. One is along this coastline where there's been a cascade of climate impacts that have affected the wildlife. There's a major fishing part of Spain. Over 50% of all Spanish fishing is done here. That's all at risk. And then I've also been working down in Portugal on a big wine and climate project down in Alentejo in the southern part of Portugal, southern third.
Well, that's good to know, and we'll come back at you for more later. But in the meantime, hi, Paul. How are you?
I'm good. And Nick was just telling me that, he was doing a bit of traveling and he was affected by of course, we had a massive bomb cyclone being pressure drops over a millibar every hour for 24 hours. So it's a very deep intensification of the low, very, very strong winds. And the winds reached hurricane, if it was on a hurricane scale, Saffir-Simpson scale, they reached category 2, category 3 even. It crossed it actually is interesting. It's related to the jet stream waviness. So the jet stream had a big dip over the US, right? That caused snow in Florida, deep cold in the US deep south. And then those winds then went across the Atlantic of the jet stream and they moved upward and they crossed over Ireland into Scotland and then continued on to Norway. So they brought very, very high winds. This is a strong extratropical storm. Extratropical, high latitude. It's not a tropical storm. And it created hurricane force winds over many parts of Ireland. And the winds were strong enough that Nick was affected. There were high winds and it diverted his plane, he was saying. So maybe just tell us a bit about how you got home with this storm, Nick.
As we started to land into Coruña, the plane just was all over the place. And he did warn us. He said it's going to be a bumpy ride. But this was a little bit out of control and we could see we were coming down very low and getting chucked around. Everyone was holding onto their seats and so on. But then we just pulled away and he dropped us off in Asturias, which is the next sort of province which is a long way away. So we landed there and they laid on buses because we were slightly out of the storm there. But as we drove on the buses into the storm much later that night, the actual bus doors started ripping open and we were just getting these winds barreling down inside the bus. People were really freaking out. So we had to pull over and then wait for another bus. And this is getting later and later. I think I got home at about 1:30 in the morning when it should have been
so it was
5 o'clock the previous day.
So basically we're all being affected one way or other by climate change. I talk about, we're in the climate casino. If your house burns down, you're in LA, you have very bad luck in the climate casino. If you live in the Appalachians and Hurricane Helene comes up and dumps water on your town, the river floods, washes away places, you have bad luck in the climate casino. These storms, I think, are just as massive or even larger than many hurricanes. And the jet stream carries them, guides them, and they come up and hit Europe. So I have to think of James Hansen's book, Storms of My Grandchildren, because these are the storms. He wrote this book, I think, a decade or so ago. And I understand he's got a new paper and stuff maybe coming out even this week. But these, and he's working on a second book, Sophie's Planet, to update this. But he wrote this book, and it was very prescient because these types of storms are much, much stronger than they used to be. They're affecting a lot more people. But anyway, let's get back to COPs, I guess. We haven't really talked about COPs.
Right.
So
I've never been to one of them.
Okay.
Oh, you go almost always, don't you?
Yes, I've been to many, but Nick's been to more. And I love your book, Nick, because I'm in it a lot. No, because it's very it's a personal account written sort of Gonzo style. And you can explain what that is. I mean, I'd never heard of that before. I heard it from you. It's Gonzo style, and it makes it very readable. It makes it a really good story about the COPs, and then you slip in all this information from all of the numerous people that you've met in different fields and their take on the climate and finance. Nick, I must remind you, we were at the COP in Baku, Azerbaijan. And I fully expected that you would ship crates of books there and flog them. He doesn't bring a single copy of his book to the COP. So marketing 0 out of 10,
Yeah, but you're right there. I'm a terrible marketer. So I started talking about the COPs from Paris in 2015 and going through each one, how the mood was changing and how the politics was reflected in the sort of dynamics of how we experience the COPs. And that was to do with the youth movement rising up after 2016, which was when Trump got elected and kind of killed the buzz of Paris. And then you had this rise of the youth movement, which went from a sort of euphoria in Spain in 2019 to anger in Glasgow. And then that was kind of chopped off by the fact that we then spent the next 3 COPs in these authoritarian regimes where protest was pretty much illegal.
By the way, if you quote somebody and you really put them into your story, do you have to get their permission?
On many of the interview quotes, I ran the excerpts parts them to check that I wasn't quoting people out of context. Or at least they didn't think I was quoting them.
Right. It's also public domain. Like, this is a conference where, you go and you chat with people, and it's all sort of public domain. I think if a person, you're talking about issues, you're not really talking about people. It's just it's just that the people part makes a really interesting story.
Except that if you get somebody saying something they wish they hadn't said. Yeah.
If there's some controversial things, we'll send it to the person,
Mm-hmm.
and they'll okay it, or they'll say, please take out, this line or that line, which happens almost never. But I mean, if there's anything controversial, then you just be a bit careful with it. How about you, Nick? I mean,
I think in fact, probably both Canadians, I think, were my biggest problem. One was a very, very well-known professor who we ended up shouting, and then we had to abort because it didn't go very well. Then but we started it again, and it actually went very well the second time. Yeah, there was a kind of an agreement that actually we got to make this work.
Yeah.
The other one was a Canadian politician from Alberta who's in the book.
Yeah.
That was really dicey. That was a COP21 in Paris. That was the first one, and that was really awkward.
Awkward, yeah.
And but really important, and it was on the record. So I mean, you have to publish things if if they're on the record.
Yes.
Person answers your question a certain way. With the book, we went through everything with the editor, and he was making judgments on whether we would need a lawyer to look at things for libel or anything like that.
Yeah,
And there were a few things I had to change where he would say, well, you need to rephrase that to say that you, from your perspective, it looks
Right.
like, because
Just,
you can't tell what someone's thinking.
Right, because it's always your perspective. Well, I think
Yeah.
Meta had some guests, unexpected guests on some of her shows, which top all of us. And she was doing live feeds on Zoom, and a couple spammers tried to show their genitals on her show.
No.
So then she lost her YouTube channel. They shut her down. It took months to recover her show, and you don't basically live feed your shows. I did a talk at Canadian Club of Rome, and I mistakenly sent the links out to some social media, and it was hacked and bombed and shut down. We had to restart. So it's okay, to give Zoom links to friends, as I did on I'm talking tomorrow on AI and climate change, and I'm inspired by the Gonzo style thing. So I'm basically using the Gonzo style for most of my talk tomorrow. And you're in part of my story, Meta. So if I write a book, you'll be in part of the book, because Meta, you're 93 or 94?
93.
93. So you lost your YouTube channel. You tried to contact them. They ignored you. You had no channel for 2 months. You do the project to save the world, and you were down. It was probably a very depressing time. So somebody in the media. You go to CBC and you talk about how you got shut down. They reinstate your account. Away you go. You want a backup. So here you are using all of this technology, right? And here's a little blurb I'm going to have you in. So you got Zoom bombed. YouTube live feed, don't do it. So then you decided you needed a backup. So not only do you post your channel on YouTube, but you also go to Substack, and then you get the transcript from the video on Substack, and you use software called Otter to generate to get the transcript pull it from the video, and then you use your subscription to AI, ChatGPT-4, to generate 1,000-word summary of the transcript, which you then go and post on Substack and social media and all the rest of it. So here you are using AI. You subscribe to it, you pay, and now the Chinese come along, and DeepSeek is a company that has superior AI, and it's completely disrupted the global AI market. Why? China has restrictions. There's export restrictions on the graphical processing units made in the West. China can't get them, the latest one. So China uses old, outdated GPU chips as the neurons in their neural nets, and they connect them probably the same way that we do, and they get a better AI. It must be in the software and in the algorithms, and then they release it to the world for free. So it completely disrupts everything. It's very, very disruptive. So when I research a topic, it's much better than just doing a Google search. It just gives you links just to use an AI. So I've been using Perplexity.ai quite a bit, but it sounds like the new one, DeepSeek, will be much, much better. So it's very disruptive. So how can we use it in climate? So we can use it for physical things and for sociological things. Physical things, in a nutshell, it's like, is there a better way to cut your carbon footprint for a process, making steel, cement, concrete, whatever? Is there a better way to build buildings? We can run climate models and maybe get better data. We can maybe predict when sea ice is going to go. We can ask it about different solar radiation management techniques and about carbon dioxide removal. The second thing is sociological, which is just as important. So here we are. We're swamped by propaganda. We're swamped by fake news. We're swamped by. We're worried about election tampering. about the billionaires in the U.S. tampering and directing elections to the right. We're worried about preserving democracy in many countries. So we could use AI to just discard rubbish on social media. Right? The AI could be smart enough that any propaganda, it just flags and says this is probably propaganda, or it just you don't see it at all on your feed. So Canada, for example, could get an AI to protect our country from the swamp of propaganda, fake news, all of this other stuff, and protect our elections. That's where I'm going.
I don't think it's as simple as all that, because
No, it's not.
with any other, I mean, you could, let's assume right now that we had sensors going through and cleaning up things. That's already always problematic. One person's freedom fighter is another person's terrorist, and so there's no objective reality that you can say, tell either AI or a human being, take this out. If you see this word, that's, the Chinese do that. If you say the word Tiananmen Square, it's erased.
Okay, so this is there's a bit of a difference, because yes, this AI, people, if you say Tiananmen Square or Taiwan, what the AI will do is it will say, I don't want to talk about this. Let's talk about something else.
But can I interject a little bit?
Yeah, Nick.
Yeah, it doesn't say this never happened, or like it doesn't lie or say anything false. It just says I don't want to talk about this topic. Right? I mean that's censorship as opposed on a specific issue. As opposed to the propaganda and fake news and lies coming from Twitter/X. It's a cesspool. Facebook could become that way. TikTok was shut down but reopened.
Let Nick speak.
Yeah. I'm done speaking. Yeah, I'll just.
Well,
listen.
I was going to say that in this current sort of disruption that you're talking about, which has been amazing because it's caused a reevaluation of all stocks in the AI supply chain. So the energy, the infrastructure, everything that they were planning that they're going to build out, with all these energy companies rubbing their hands together, which it also massively negatively impacts climate change. This Chinese DeepSeek has upended that. But what was interesting to me in the FT reporting was that this can go onto tiny computers like a Raspberry Pi, for example, these tiny little things, which are not very powerful. But you could be running your own AI agent on that. And it could be, as you say, not so much a sensor, but you could set it yourself to have a fact checker, for example.
Yes.
And but there are so many other applications, but it decentralizes the power. Yeah. And that's the problem, I think, with all of the AI and that we see, or what we were being force fed, is that we lack a lot of agency in it. We're being told we're the end users, we can type in what we want, but ultimately it's just sucking up all of our personal IP. And I think that, I don't know what Paul thinks about this, but I think these decentralized things, so you could even have a watch that has your own, could be your assistant on so many different levels, but it's cut off from the mainframe. It's within your sort of own control, if you like, from a sociological sort of standpoint. Or you could create your own network among your family or your colleagues, or however you want to do it.
I'd like to get back to talking about COP. It's really getting a bad reputation, when it's all run by, the heads of countries that are all fossil fuel producers.
The way it's presented often in the media is that it's the COP's fault, that the COP is the bad guy, that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change is just not working. But really, it's only not working because it's undermined by specific governments and lobbyists who have an interest in preserving the status quo of the 20th century. And they're holding back the 21st century because they have benefited so much from it that they don't actually care if it kills us, because they can't see how they prosper in the new unforeseen now and the sort of future. Because as Paul said, James Hansen wrote Storms of Our Grandchildren 10 years ago, and in the 80s, he stood before Congress and talked about that we needed to change our path. In 1992, we had the Rio Earth Summit, where the members of the UN stood up and said, if we don't sort this problem out, the countries of the world, then there will come a point in this century where human life could become terminal. It is basically, it comes to an end. And since then, the COP process, which emerged in the mid-90s, has really been trying to tackle that. But no one's actually been trying to really tackle it. They're not willing to do the things that would result in the outcome that we desperately need. And every year that we kick the ball down the road, it's not that we don't go to the COP the next year with the same problem we had last year. We're compounding the problem. So it's always getting bigger. It's always getting much harder for us to solve. And the impacts are getting so ferocious now. And in 2012, when I interviewed James Hansen in Vienna, he said, if we wait another decade to start taking action on climate change, then I don't think it will be possible, because with the reductions that we would have to make would be so steep in terms of the emissions reductions and so on, that it would just crash our global economy, and that in itself would have knock-on effects in terms of stability and conflicts and so on. And what we see now is we've got the worst of all situations. We've got this earth sensitivity issue, which Paul is much more better at articulating than I am. But the earth is proving to be much more sensitive than we thought. We're getting a lot more impacts much faster. So-called thresholds or tipping points, or whatever people want to call them, are being triggered. And we're seeing that we're living on a knife edge. We're getting the climate casino that Paul likes to talk about is everywhere. And we don't know where it's going to strike next. But then it's the natural systems that underpin our existence, like the oceans, the ecosystems, are also all collapsing. And yet we have these world leaders who are basically jokers. They're not qualified to do the jobs they should be doing. And that should really worry all of us, because you just said, you don't trust the cops. But when all these world leaders who are not qualified, who are really just interested in either staying in power or preserving their wealth, come to the cops, they're letting us all down. They're really undermining our future and our children's future and grandchildren and so on. And so I think, I would say, or someone actually said this before the last COP, if it didn't exist, we'd have to create it, because we need a framework where nations of the world come together and try to have an articulate adult conversation about navigating our pathway to the future. And it doesn't exist. So, I mean, I would really, my thing, just to end this section, I would just say that we need to regain agency in terms of how we, steer the narrative back towards what we want the outcome to be.
The cops, people say they haven't halted climate change, but they've slowed it down for sure. They've had some effect, I think.
Really?
But we would credit the scientists, wouldn't we, with bringing this knowledge and research to the table. And although there hasn't been the appropriate response, there's been this incremental response. And although it's not getting us there, it's tried to steer the nose of the ship into the right direction, but it hasn't succeeded. But Paul's right.
I would wonder couldn't we have a kind of a voluntary association of countries? That is, countries that are seriously committed could join privately, form an extra IPCC, a shadow IPCC, where they would do everything that needs to be done, and hold COPs and everything, but it would be done just by groups of countries that intend to actually get something done and get serious. And wouldn't that have some weight?
Well, that's that's what Salim Huq, Dr. Salim Huq, who's passed away a couple of years ago, but he was a great voice for the poorer countries in the most vulnerable countries in the global south, but he used to call it a coalition of the willing. And he said, the poorest nations are so desperate that have to come to the COPs because it's the only forum they have where they have a voice. There's no other meeting in the world where they
The only
consider
game in town, basically.
yeah, it's the only game in town.
Yeah.
There's no other place they can go and speak with the US, Canada, the EU, China, Japan, So that coalition of the willing is something that they've been trying to get off the ground. And, it's very tricky because any leader in the world can go to a COP and say, yeah, we're going to do it. We're going to slash our emissions. We're going to give loads of money to the vulnerable nations who have suffered because of our previous emissions. And then they go home and they try and get it through their own parliament, and the parliament says, forget it, we're not doing that. And they get voted out at the next election or kicked out by a coup or whatever. So it is tricky to do it because we've kind of embedded the sort of a certain way of life into our whole existence in the richer parts of the world, especially.
I would say that the bright spark in addressing climate change is China. China's solar power electricity generation is doubling every 3 years. It's going to pass nuclear for electricity generation in a year. It's going to pass wind in a couple of years. In a decade, we're going to get more electricity from solar than from all other energy sources combined. So there's that going on. Meanwhile, on the other hand, it's a race against a collapsing climate, and it is collapsing. Like, the turmoil is spreading worldwide. It's driving inflation up higher, although it's never really given credit for driving up inflation. It means that we're heading to probably global food shocks.
The COP itself is becoming a sort of a real time. It used to be about the future, and now it's becoming much more about real time. And as you're talking about food inflation, the climate change is already adding 30% to food inflation in the UK at the moment. And this is impacting people's lives, and yet they don't necessarily associate it with climate change. And it's how do we now, because we go forward to the next COP, which is going to be in the Amazon in Brazil, and a region that we call the lungs of the earth, which is being mined and crossing its own sort of threshold of viability. How do we operate now in a real political and social space where we achieve things that are absolutely vital? I mean, if it's possible to get us out of this mess. I mean, we're asking the impossible, given the current hijacking of the political system in America. In the UK, it's underway, and you can see it in all the European countries and around the world. There's this sort of hijacking of the truth by non-truth, which ultimately sustains fossil fuel use. And then we go into the COP and everyone's like, well, you guys are all powerless. And it's true, but it's only powerless because the people at home aren't leaning really hard on their politicians. And they're not doing that because they're not really getting access to the right information. And you can see this sort of feeding all the way through from the top table at a COP to the dining room table in someone's house. There is a sort of a chain that links all the way back. And there's people like, well, I don't want to name specific names, but people who are in charge of big media platforms and so on, newspapers, they are intervening and they're stopping the flow of vital information, or they're confusing it by allowing so many voices that we literally don't know who's telling the truth and who's lying. And quite often the liars are center stage with all the money and to promote their own messages and so on.
Okay, now one of the things that I would be curious about is how does the agenda get set, and how do the speakers and the power, the influencers who are going to be on stage or giving presentations or having an effect at COP, how do they get chosen, or how do they get unchosen and discouraged from participating? And for example, it's not just an example, but I think it's a key issue, is I'm very much more inclined to look for technological solutions, geoengineering. I don't mind even using the word. I do sort of believe that there's if there's any hope left, it's mostly because of that, and I'm not sure that there's that much hope left, but that's what I would put my bets on. But I'm told that it's not talked about, and the IPCC poo-poos most of these things or somehow dismisses it, and that the same goes on in the COP meetings, that these issues or the proponents of these new proposals, technological solutions, don't get on the stage. And tell me about that. Is that true? And if so, what can be done to fix that?
Okay, well, that's been a really interesting dynamic, I think, of the COPs. When I was at COP21, the only geoengineering interview I did was with Paul, basically.
Yeah.
So, and to give credit to Paul, he's consistently giving the same messages today. And over the last few years, that started to change. That there started to emerge one meeting, one presentation, one panel, and these are not in the negotiations that go on behind closed doors in the COP. These are in the sort of the more discourse side of the COP, so in the meetings side, which are accessed by people like me from the media and so on. But what's been interesting is that the old arguments that we were engaging with a decade ago around climate engineering, geoengineering, and so on, how they stagnated, and it was almost like it wasn't worth having these conversations because no one was saying anything interesting or new. But in the last few years, a lot of young people from the global south have said, we need this. Our country is not going to survive as it is. We're going to be overcome by sea level rise, which is already committed, or the storms are already destroying everything we have. I interviewed someone in Central America who said that after the last storms, it's not just about rebuilding the house and the street, but it's about the whole social and economic development of the country gets set back by decades. So that he's saying, for example, not letting us have a say on this issue of whether geoengineering should be on the table is a human rights issue, that we should be allowed to have more of a say on this. Whereas the scientists who do come to the COPs and who are passionately saying we shouldn't have it on the table are saying that because the science, from their perspective, is saying that it shouldn't be investigated because it's too dangerous. And then other scientists are saying, well, there's also the problem, and these people are not for it either. But what if a billionaire sees how bad things are and realizes actually it's quite cheap? I could fund this program, and just says I'm going to do it without any research telling us whether it's good or bad, or whether he's actually going to kill more people than he's going to save. So there's all these things that ultimately point to the fact that we need to know. We need to know what the good technologies are, what the bad ones are. Are they all bad? Are there more than one that's good? And there should be not just £1 billion, but £1 trillion, dollars, euros, whatever you want, put into this to have a really international. And we've seen, just with the AI discussion we had earlier, we've seen how dynamic these discussions are. When one person can't do it, the other person says, well, we've come up with something that completely you didn't think of. And I think if we can advance that, in terms of getting it into the main negotiations, the IPCC process, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is the scientific body of the UN, which advises the negotiators, if more studies are submitted to those, this came up at the last COP actually by the IPCC, if more studies on geoengineering are submitted to the IPCC reports, then eventually they filter into the reporting and they get to the policymakers. So there is a process.
What if there's no funding for the research? I mean, if you say these studies must be submitted, but how can I have dozens of people that I know who are in favor of doing particular research, but they couldn't get the funding to do it. Can they just go and talk about their proposal for funding or their idea of what might happen without having actually conducted any real, empirical work?
in the UK, the government have just allocated quite a few million. I can't remember the exact number now, but millions towards geoengineering research for not stratospheric, but all kinds of solar radiation management, which is managing the sunlight that hits the Earth. And I think that there's another scientist who started up an institute in Chicago focused on geoengineering, which is all well financed.
Meta, as climate worsens, as the impacts become more and more severe, there becomes more urgency to find anything. And this is why, the funding will come when needed. I mean, I'll give you the example of
the research takes 10 years sometimes.
No, Meta. Look, I'll give you an example. DeepSeek is a startup in China. It started in 2023. Okay. On the weekend, it released their product, DeepSeek, which completely disrupted the AI companies in the Western world. And it's using crappy chips. It's using far fewer of them. Right? No, what I'm saying is something like this can change extremely quickly. Like if you gave me $1 billion, I could cool the planet 0.5 degree within about 6 months. Okay, I could deploy that money as a billionaire could. If I got a billionaire to support me, I could do that. I'd probably be in jail because it would be illegal, right? But the point is this stuff can happen extremely quickly if the need arises.
But Paul, I tell you, I've been interviewing people. I've probably done 50 or 100 people. And when I ask them, how long is it going to take you to do this research? And most of them will say like 6 or 7 or 8 years.
Well, look, when World War II happened, we changed everything on a dime. Okay, we stopped building cars, we built tanks.
Look,
right? Things can happen very quickly. If we don't have enough food to eat on this planet and billions of people start to starve, or millions, we're going to do things differently. Like disruption, this is all what disruption is. It's a nonlinear process.
But I would come back on that and say, there are thresholds where once you cross, you can't. You're responsive. I mean, if you're talking about a geoengineering to crudely reduce the planet's temperature, fine. But the planet is, quite a big, complex system. So it's not going to just respond, tip us back to where we were before. Right. There's going to be knock-on effects. You're always going forward. So, I mean, these are highly, highly complex.
I mean, we don't have a decade to do this research on these techniques because we're going to have global food shortages before then.
I'm in favor of, and I talked to Hugh Hunt, who used an interesting analogy.
Yeah,
I believe that we should start deploying things already, but just on a very small scale.
And
watch what happens. I mean, it's like sticking your toe in the water before you dive in. You do it a little bit and check it out as you're going. He gave an example of in the Apollo, that flight that they had the terrible thing.
Yeah,
they
Apollo 13.
They had to rescue people using something that they had never tested. They knew that they were working on it, but it wasn't ready. They would never have used it, except that in that emergency, it was the only thing they had. So they did it, and it worked. And I feel sort of the same way. We should be starting to use all of these technologies.
Yeah, I agree completely.
Mm-hmm. But I don't know how much. I'm not sure that Nick actually agrees. I mean, Nick, how are you? How are you situated on that issue? Are you most of the people I talk to will say, well, maybe we should start doing research. That's a bold statement because a lot of people don't even want to do research. But as far as actually starting to deploy things and use it, I think I'm pretty radical on that. How about you?
Well, I mean, I've done so many interviews on it, even interviewing Rowan Williams, the former Archbishop of Canterbury, about geoengineering. And he gave me a very good idea, a very good quote, which was, I'd like to say what it is. I'd like to know what it is I'm saying no to. And what he was saying is that we need to fund the research. And I don't think I personally can say whether it's a good idea or not because I'm not qualified. But I would say that we should just allocate trillions to finding out pretty damn smart and make sure our learning is like that.
Yeah.
And have an idea. And I totally agree with Paul about the risk of famine, which is probably baked in now. We're in for a really rough time, and I think we're going to get past some thresholds where most of this becomes redundant because we've just left it too late. So I would say immediate Manhattan-style project to research these technologies. I like Hugh's idea, but there's going to be ferocious opposition to it. So you've got to have a lot of information disbursement, get the public involved. I think citizens' assemblies would be really good. And I think there's a good argument.
Citizens' assemblies on this issue.
Wonderful. I think globally.
You're my partner. Look, I've been thinking about that, and I love the idea of citizens' assembly working on this. How can we make that happen big scale?
Well, they had one in Scotland, and I interviewed the lady who runs it. It was fascinating to see how great it was, because they had all these people who are selected randomly to be on this assembly, and then they got loads of climate experts. So this was about creating the Scottish sort of climate bill, and the guy who introduced me to that was Kevin Anderson, who's a professor in the UK, who's really good on a lot of energy and policy and all that kind of thing. So he was one of the experts. These people with different backgrounds, different views on life, get to review the same evidence, and then they all come together, and it's compiled into a report to advise policymakers.
Right.
And then the policymakers can't ignore it. They have to respond to the evidence. And now the climate and nature bill actually was voted down by the government in London last week. I did an interview with one of the main advisors on that on Wednesday, and that's a shame. But at least now,
did that come out of a citizens' assembly?
It had an assembly within it. So if it had passed, it would have created a climate and nature assembly in the UK for Westminster to start really looking at the main problems, which are also around resilience, rewilding, all the things that we're ignoring at the moment. So, yeah, I really think that the assembly idea, we always talk about, well, when these things kick in or when the problems get bigger, we need bold leaders and less democracy, because democracy is too cumbersome. But citizens' assembly allow you to expand democracy and get the right information in. And then you can actually start making informed decisions with everyone on side. So you have agency, you have responsibility, you have knowledge, evidence. And I think geoengineering would be one topic which would be great to sort of have this on and take it out of the academic sphere.
Well, okay. I have actually been very engaged with that question. And one of the things that I did for a while was I joined something that was just getting going. And as far as I know, it must have collapsed because I haven't heard from them in months. But they had what I was extremely impressed with. I didn't know that it was possible. They were basically using a Zoom meeting. And they had people from many, many different countries speaking many, many different languages. And they had simultaneous translation by word, things written across the screen. So when somebody's speaking Chinese, I would get the English translation as they spoke. And I didn't know that could be done on a scale that it was. They had many languages they could translate that way. And they had meetings where they would pick the topic that they were going to address for the next 2 or 3 sessions, and so on. It was going extremely well. I think you could run, in effect, a parliamentary assembly for the United Nations by having people from every country chosen by sortition, and have people from all walks of life appear from their own living rooms, not having to meet, not having to travel, not having any having to pay for any expenses. A good, even a fairly big millionaire, maybe somebody who's well short of a billionaire, if they wanted to fund it, I could do it. And you and I could do it because I've seen it done, and I know it can be done. And it'd be possible to create a real cross section of humanity and have them meet for a year, listening and participating, let's say every week, as people come in, giving the kinds of talks that they would at COP, and only the participants themselves could participate in jointly decide what kinds of submissions they want to hear, who they want to listen to, as well as, of course, it does give quite a bit of power to the organizers to assemble the people and to assemble the speakers. But, still, it can be created in such a way that it's clearly very democratic. And I really think that is the solution to all kinds of global problems that, especially, of course, climate change.
Okay.
Have you heard anybody doing that? I think at one of the COPs, like 7 or 8 years ago, there was such a thing organized. And I've never been able to talk to the man who did it, but I've talked to people who've worked with him. I want to pursue that because I think that could be done at very low cost, getting people in their own living rooms to do this kind of listening and participating and discussing.
Okay, but once you get the results from this citizen assembly, I mean, do you have a report which then goes to politicians? Like, how do you get it to the policymakers and the change makers within a government? That's often the hardest thing to do.
It is, of course. It would be for a global thing, but on the other hand, already France has something that has been a citizens' assembly that they have been doing on climate with under the Macron called for it and set it up, and
Right.
I don't know much about it for France, but I do know that to my mind, if you could show that you have 100 or 200 people worldwide and that they have been truly chosen by sortition, like a jury would be chosen as a representative of their country, and their social class, their age group, their educational level, their occupational level, is so stratified social sampling, and then they spend a year talking and listening together to the evidence. You can't ignore that. Somebody is going to make that into a big story.
Yeah.
How can we do it? You need just put me in touch with a couple of super millionaires. You need, enough money to.
We're all looking for a billionaire to support our work, right?
I think we can do this for $2-3 million. I think I could do it for $2 or $3 million.
Yeah.
Give me some money.
Yeah.
In doing the work in Portugal, and this was the Wines Valentejo Sustainability Program, and it was set up by a guy who was working for the Wine Commission. And one of the main things that accelerated resilience in this very climate vulnerable area was just simply getting the wine producers all together and giving them workshops by experts, but then letting them from there share their experiences, what worked and what didn't work. Whereas before they never spoke to each other because they were competitors, but then they become collaborators, and then they still compete when they're out in the marketplace. But on a day-to-day basis, they call each other if something works or doesn't work. They share what's going on, and everyone in the program, their resilience has gone like this: the rewilding, the biodiversity boost, their ability to withstand multiple days of 45 degrees, long drought periods, and so on is absolutely astounding. It was actually Jason Box who, when he was down there, he was totally sort of blown away by it.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, community is so important. Coffee shops are so important. Meeting other people, talking to strangers on a bus. That's the part that builds apathy in people, builds democracy, right? With social media, we've gone. You know, we still have our emphasis on personal. You can have all your friends and relatives, close family members, and you can contact them wherever they are in the world on social media. You're also on issues. We tend to form tribes of people. You know, the climate deniers are in a tribe. The anti-vaxxers are in a tribe. We get all of these tribes, but what we're getting is the community part is being suppressed, and COVID really didn't help society. The idea of people even working from home, I'm completely against. We need to get people back in offices, talking to each other, talking to other people that don't agree with their opinions. And so there's a whole, I'm going to show you this. This is the Atlantic magazine, February edition.
I've read
The
that
anti,
article.
the Anti-Social Century by Derek Thompson. Vital information about how society is changing. We're becoming more antisocial, and this is a problem for democracy, right? It's a huge problem for democracy. We
And
need to look at
hold on,
reversing this.
what that guy decides is that his definition of being alone means being alone without a computer. I do not think that I'm alone. According to him, I'm alone, and this is really bad for me. But no, I'm not alone because I'm with you guys, and I'm just as much with you as if you were sitting right here. So I think his whole theory is cuckoo because,
Yeah. No, I have to disagree strongly with you, Meta.
well,
Right? I'm
I
not
have to-
getting personal vibes. Like if I was sitting across from you and Nick right now for coffee, I would get far more out of this meeting. The endorphins would be triggered and stuff. It is different being on screens. It is different. I mean, is this a world we're going to
the
on
only thing
screens?
I can't do is I can't hug anybody. I miss that.
Yeah.
Apart from that, I get as much. I have the richest social life I
Okay.
could have
Okay, Meta.
imagined.
Yes, but what?
Never
But
in my life could I have
Right.
imagined that I could
Right.
call up somebody who's an ambassador or a
Yes.
foreign minister and get an interview and have a conversation. And I do every week.
Right. No, of course, but you're if you were a teenager and you just had Zoom meetings with your friends and you didn't go out and play with them and have, like play some sports or social stuff, it's totally different for that age group. Each of us is going through a journey in our life and at
And now
different
we're here
phases.
to talk about climate.
Well, we're
The
talking
real
about
problem is
society,
I
Meta.
talk to people about climate every week,
Right.
several times a week, often.
We're coming to an
on Zoom, and
Right.
it's very meaningful, and it's very important to me. But I don't have any political influence. There's no way I can influence what the government of Canada is going to do in terms of funding the kinds of projects that I think it ought to be funded. Now that's the problem. You put your finger on it a while ago.
Right.
Go back to that, Nick. How are we going to get real political influence?
That's the $100 million billion question. I think it's now we have to accept that it is a fight, basically. And it's a fight for our agency. It's a fight for the future. It's a fight for all the things that we talk about all the time.
We care about.
And you've got to find ways, and it can be talking to a relative who's thinks it's all a hoax, or it could be talking to you've got to try and break through. And it's things like this, what you're doing here is part of that. It's part of the global dialogue we're trying to have now. And yeah, I think we've just got to keep expanding it, keep push harder, and try. I think that in the end, the bad guys undo themselves. They become ridiculous because everything they say doesn't work. But it's about us being organized to take back the
When
agenda.
you go to a COP, is there any more opportunity there for you to talk to, an energy minister of Portugal or whatever than
Absolutely.
you would have had otherwise? Do people really interact with people who have power? Is there any? Does COP do anything worthwhile along those lines?
Yeah, I think it's a galvanizing space for especially people who are the victims. So they are usually there, waving their arms, confronting ministers directly, and
Yeah.
they get an opportunity to do that. Scientists occasionally, usually in a sanctioned way, get a chance to sit opposite someone and call them out. But it's and there's a lot of people who go there and they're able to get through and go and meet and speak face to face with people they may have spent the rest of the year getting blank phone call replies to.
Yeah.
So there is a huge opportunity in that, and that is part of the pressure. But it needs the work to be done beforehand, so that when you
Yeah.
get to that point, you asked earlier about where do the decisions made about what gets discussed in the negotiations. There are the intercessional meetings that happen earlier in the year in Bonn in Germany
Hmm.
at the UN, and that's where they set the agenda for what's going to happen at the COP. But most of these issues are being kicked from one COP to the other, and a little bit of it will be done incrementally here. It could be finance, it could be loss and damage, it can be it can be emissions, it can be sort of a range of different things. So each thing is going along like this from COP to COP, but we're only getting this much when we need sort of this much in terms of the outcome. And what we've got to do is somehow on the social side, whether it's through coalitions of the winning, forming citizens' assemblies or groups, lobby groups, whatever works in our individual spheres, and pushing it as
Yeah.
hard as you can.
I think it energizes people. Like I go to the COP, I come back, I'm all inspired to work and put out climate videos and talk to you and talk to Nick and interview people with Climate Emergency Forum. It energizes us even because the we're not working to try for success. Like we don't expect success. If we expected success, we would have given up this thing, a decade ago, right? We expect it's going to be difficult, but we know we're doing the right thing. So I get energized by going to these. I just wish they wouldn't keep being in fossil fuel countries, right? Which we need to move away from that and have. I don't. Why are fossil fuel lobbyists? If they made up a country, they'd be the biggest country at each COP. The number of
What
lobbyists.
about the thing in Brazil? Is there any hope that it will be run any differently because it's run in Brazil?
Sure, we always hope that.
Well,
Yeah,
it's a
I think
realistic
so.
basis for hope.
I'm about to interview a Brazilian journalist about the COP, the road to COP, and a lot of the issues surrounding the Amazon. I think it'll be more than one interview, but there's a lot of things embedded within the idea of having a COP in the Amazon. It's the location, the actual real issues facing the Amazon forest, which are structural and political, the failures that have gone before and are still, baked into the system of destruction there. So these are really complex things to unpick. But even US withdrawing, Bloomberg has stepped in saying he'll finance the American states who want to participate. Jay Inslee did a call before the last COP saying that there's a number of states who are absolutely committed to reducing their emissions in line with the Paris Agreement. They represent over 60% of US emissions. So they're all still in. So it's not a total despair.
Right.
There are things going on, and it's how do you get in sync with those good things and try and accelerate them, I would say.
It sounds like you haven't aren't too despairing because of Trump's position that he's obviously going to kill everything he can that we would value, but maybe he can't kill everything.
I think that he's just a sort of more like some weird specter. I don't think he doesn't have the power that he thinks he has because time is always moving against him too. So there are things like the development of green energy or renewable energy in states that are Republican. I mean, the job losses, if he actually cut those, would be phenomenal, and he wouldn't get re-elected. So, there are forces at play that make it difficult, even for an evil idiot like that.
We'll have to call it to a close, but it certainly gives me plenty of stuff to edit You know, it'll be a whole afternoon's adventure editing this.
Thank you very
so
much for having me.
It's been
Yes.
fun. All
Well,
right.
it's thank you. It's been wonderful to chat.
Yeah,
Okay.
It's been lovely to meet you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay.
Bye-bye,
Goodbye.
guys.
Bye bye.